So thank you everyone for joining us. Of course, we're delighted on behalf of the Women at Google Speaker Series to have Christie Hefner with us, who for the past 20 years was the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Playboy Incorporated. And I know an iconic figure for many people, including many of the folks in this room, certainly myself, and I think leaders, both men and women across America. A little bit about Christy. I think you probably have all known and heard of her over the past 20 years during her period at the helm of Playboy. But what's really interesting to me about Christy, and we're going to ask her about some of this, is first of all, and she'll tell you herself, her choice and decision to join the company, especially I think being widely regarded as a leader of strong values, feminist in nature, if I could say so, and a big proponent of two specific areas that I think have been really characterized her time in leadership. One, really free expression, which is I think something that all of us as Googlers resonate with, and a big proponent of the First Amendment rights, and also of diversity in the workplace, and really bringing more light to shed on women in positions of leadership and really being an advocate for that cause as well. So I know she's known to us for her role as an executive, but also known to many for her really advocacy of these issues. Some of the key milestones during her tenure at Playboy, in 1994, she put Playboy on the web. It was the first magazine to be on the web during that time period. And interestingly, if you go back to 1994, only 5% of the American population was on the web. So what seems to us to be a very obvious decision was perhaps in many ways not that obvious, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. In 2003, not only did she take Playboy.com and make it a profitable entity on the web, and expanded its business models to include e-commerce, subscription, gaming, but she also added a wireless component to the business. And so I think Christy has a lot to share with us, not just on traditional media, but as importantly in the development of digital media for Playboy and for other magazines. It's interesting, of course, as I said, we all know her, but Christy's been recognized in a number of different venues for all of her work. In terms of pioneering Playboy into the digital age, she was acknowledged as a Wonder Woman by multi-channel news for her major accomplishments in cable and broadband. She was placed in the Digital Hall of Fame by leading industry publication Min. She currently serves on the board and the executive committee for the Magazine Publishers Association, as well as the Government Affairs Committee of that association. Interestingly, she was the first woman ever elected to the Chicago chapter of YPO, Young Presidents Organization. She helped found the Committee of 200, which is an organization of international women owners and executives. She sits on the national board for Springboard, which many of you may be aware is an initiative led to really drive women-led growth businesses. Founding partner of the Directors Council, which was really dedicated to increasing women on boards. In 1991, she was inducted into the Women's Business Development Center Hall of Fame for opening doors and building opportunity for all women entrepreneurs. In 2002, she received the National Cable and Telecommunications Association's Vanguard Award for Distinguished Leadership. And that's really the cable industry's highest honor for her longstanding commitment to both First Amendment rights of cable programmers and operators, and her strong advocacy of workplace diversity. So just absolutely delighted to have her here. We've got, I think, 7 different Google offices that are also on VC and audio, and we'll try to go to you all as well as the audience in the room for questions. So the way we thought we'd kick this off is maybe with me asking Christy a couple questions, but as with everything Googler style, we really want to make this interactive. So there's a mic over here, and as you have questions, please come to the mic, and we'll try and intersperse questions from myself as well as questions from the audience and really make this as interactive a dialogue as possible. So if you have questions, just start to progress towards the mic, and we'll try and make this as interactive a dialogue as possible. Perhaps the first thing, Christy, that you could do for us is just set the stage on Playboy, because it was certainly a surprise to me, who's long held Playboy as a magazine icon, that it really is a fairly diversified media company. So maybe you could just set the stage for the folks here on what have you built over the past 20 years in terms of Playboy's diversity.
Okay. Well, my father started Playboy in 1953, literally at our kitchen table. And like many great entrepreneurs, he was begging and borrowing money to put out the first issue. His total capital for that first issue was $6,000, and that included mortgaging our furniture, I understand not once but twice. Wow. I'm not sure you're actually allowed to do, but he did. And his vision was to produce a first-class men's lifestyle magazine that would bring together what he thought were the interests of his generation of young men who'd grown up with very conservative parents, where kind of work was what you did to support your family, it wasn't your passion, and where play was actually a little suspect. And that generation went to World War II and came back and started to feel that maybe there was a different kind of life than what their fathers had lived and their grandfathers, much in the same way as about a decade plus later, Betty Friedan and some of the early feminists would start to rethink, the roles and opportunities for women. So the first issue went out on the stands with no month on it because he'd worked at Esquire, and he knew that the way newsstands know when to send back unsold magazines is they look and see when the week or the month's expired. So he had this idea that if they didn't know that it was like past its expiration, they'd keep more copies out and he could sell enough to fund the second issue.
Wow.
And that was the beginning of Playboy. And he would say, if he were sitting here, that his dream was no more grandiose than that the magazine be successful enough that he wouldn't have to get a real job. And he would be the first one to say that he had no capacity to dream what would happen. In the last 20 years, and then we can go back over any of this, it's interesting, when I joined the company, that was 33 years ago. And it was a company that had diversified into a lot of other businesses. It had a modeling agency and a limousine company and a book club and a record business and a movie production company and hotels and clubs and many different businesses. But like I think other American companies that had diversified so broadly, it was a scope of businesses far beyond the ability of a medium-sized company to have the expertise or infrastructure to be competitive. And so the company was sort of trying to rethink what it wanted to be. And in the early 80s, got into some trouble as an American company operating in the UK with casino licenses, the only American company, and exited that which was its most profitable business. And so all of a sudden, that which had kind of supported this broad portfolio of businesses, many of which were not profitable, was gone. And the company needed to figure out what it could rebuild around. I'd been in the company 7 years. I wound up becoming president, which we can talk about or not, but basically what I envisioned was an opportunity to take this extraordinary magazine, which had quickly become the best-selling magazine for young men in America and today is in the world, and do something different than other magazine companies had done before. What other magazine companies had done is say, hey, we have this magazine, it's Rolling Stone or it's Time magazine. What we should do is we should start other magazines, because that's what we are. We're a magazine company, and that's how magazines grew. Entrepreneurs started them, then they became part of a company, and then the company grew by acquiring or starting new ones. And I think partly because I came into the presidency at a time when cable TV was just starting, we started to develop this idea that maybe the asset to leverage was not the publishing expertise, but the brand. And the brand as representative of a style of entertainment and quality of journalism and a sense of sort of fun and sort of a sexy lifestyle. And so we moved over those years first into pay TV and then online and then mobile and then consumer products and stores and location-based entertainment via licensing, so that today the company reaches more consumers than it ever has because it's in businesses that are truly global, whether it's 25 editions of the magazine around the world, or television in 100 countries, or the internet, which of course is boundaryless, or the consumer products that are sold all over the world. So we've moved from being a domestic magazine company to being an international brand-driven multimedia and lifestyle company, and that's kind of been the arc.
Yeah, and it is very interesting, because if you were to look at Playboy's financials, in fact, it reflects that same thing, which is while it does have the traditional magazine, and arguably that's sort of one of the anchors of the brand, and the television assets, it's actually quite staggering to see that the licensing business of Playboy, right, which is purely, if you think about it, a brand-driven business, is one of the most profitable areas of the company.
The most profitable.
The most profitable. Yeah. And then, of course, digital is also
the second most
profitable, which makes sense. Again, leveraging the core asset, which is the brand. So it is a really interesting evolution. I think most people think Playboy and think magazine, but interestingly, the company has added so much more. Before we go on to talking about digital and the evolution of digital and how that got introduced, I think there are, of course, things that everybody here is curious about. And I warned Christy that we couldn't have any conversation with her without asking this question, so we'll just ask it, which is, okay, you join Playboy, you go on to become president. It's a fact, in fact, your career for the last 33 years. But a lot of people would say, okay, woman, arguably feminist characteristics, joining Playboy, which is primarily male-dominated, unconventional career choice. To which you say?
Well, honestly, I didn't join thinking it would be my career. Yeah. So that's the reality of it. My father and mother divorced when I was very young. I saw my dad, but I saw him just a few times a year. So we didn't live together when I was growing up or when my brother was growing up. And I think after I graduated Brandeis and I'd worked as a journalist for a year, and I thought that I wasn't going to stay in journalism and I was going to go to law school. My father suggested that I move back to Chicago and come to work for the company. But I don't think that he thought that that meant that I was going to stay and run the company someday. I think he thought that meant that he'd get to spend time with me, and it was no more complicated than that. And what I thought was, it's kind of like, a junior year abroad. It'd be kind of an interesting thing to do for a year or so, and then I would go on with my life. So it wasn't something I thought of as a career decision when I joined. Having joined, I was surprised by how fascinating the people were. Because I don't have to say in this room, if you're in a business that is kind of on the cutting edge, that's dealing in the world of ideas, it tends to attract smart, creative people. And it's just fun to work with smart, creative people. And Playboy had the added advantage, which would also, I think, be probably true here, in that it had a very well-known, sort of liberal, humanistic set of views about the world. My father had written many articles in the magazine that became known as the Playboy philosophy. The Playboy Foundation had been started that was doing all this work. So it also tended to attract people who were progressive as well as smart and creative, and that makes, in my view, a pretty interesting group of people. So I sort of fell in love with the people, and then I found the variety of the business issues and sort of what the company was facing intriguing. And so I sort of, a year passed, and 2 years passed, and 3 years passed, and 4 years passed, and 5 years passed. And then I picked up a newspaper one day, and my father was quoted answering a question about, well, do you think, Christy's going to run the company someday? And he said, oh, yes, I think so someday. I was like, well, you didn't discuss it with me. I mean, we'd never had a conversation about it, but it made me think about it. And I thought, well, would I want to do that? I wonder how that would be. And then a couple years after that, is when the company got into these financial difficulties, and it was clear that the then president, who had been recruited from outside the company, was going to have to be replaced. And it seemed to me, I'd been on the board of directors for 3 years by then, that there were basically two choices. The company could do a search and look for the new person, or see if there was some way to put in place people from the company to move the company forward. And I went to my father and the board, because the company was already public, and said, I think I could form an office of the president with the man who was the chief financial officer with whom I'd worked, and that we could turn the company around. And instead of waiting 6 months to find a candidate, and then that person has to spend 6 months learning the business and getting trust, we could sort of get started right away. I was 29 years old. The company had just lost $50 million. The stock was at like zero. And in hindsight, I think, what possibly made me think that I could do this?
But you did it.
Well, I did it, and I think part of it is that classic, what you don't know, right? In other words, I had no idea all the things I didn't know. Now, fortunately, I knew enough. I'm a quick learner. I know you need to work with a team. I have analytical skills. There are a lot of things that I could leverage. But like a lot of things in business and in life, people do things that seemingly couldn't be done because They don't know enough to know they can't be done, and they just try and do them.
So you're 29 and you step into the president's role and begin to craft a strategy with the CFO to really exit some of these unprofitable businesses. And then did you shed, and just sort of set aside because I'm also fascinated by the story, did you exit and go back to the core and then rebuild from there?
Yes. I mean, the first order of business was just to make sure the company survived. And so, you know, for those of you who have MBAs, this is called rationalizing the lines of business. For those of you like me who don't, this is called dumping the losers. So we said, out, sell, close down, you know, sort of stripped all that away. It seemed to me just intuitively that less overhead was good, that pushing the decisions to the people that were closer to the customers was smart. So we tried to sort of do all that in the first few years, and then just start to think about, well, we had this magazine, we had this brand, what would we do with it?
Got it. And then from there you grew back.
Right.
And part of charting the course and growing back was what, in hindsight again, seems like a fairly not to be taken for granted decision, was the entry into digital. So at this point, I take it, it's 1994, Playboy has emerged from that first period of turbulence.
Yes.
Is relatively stable.
Yes.
And how does the decision to go into digital come upon you? What made it a rational choice at that point?
Well, I think one of the key things that laid the groundwork for the move into digital was the fact we were already successful in cable and satellite television. So we'd already demonstrated that you could take the brand and style of content and move it into another medium and build a business. Now, at the time that we moved into pay television in the 80s, that was actually a pretty common strategy for magazine companies, and actually I think at the time maybe even some newspaper companies. That is to say, because cable now offered this opportunity, I know this will sound stunning to those of you that are young, but we went from 3 channels, which is what I grew up with, to what was on average about 24 channels. But that was like revolutionary. And what it offered was obviously the potential of making channels their own destinations. So instead of saying, I'm going to watch this show, if you had that many channels, you had at least the potential to say, well, what if you programmed a whole channel that had an identity that people would then, you know, make a destination of? So everybody from Good Housekeeping to Fortune, everybody was talking about they were going to have a line of videos and they were going to have a channel. And today, in 2009, there is only one magazine that is a branded television channel, even in the United States, never mind around the world, and that's Playboy. And in hindsight, I think, you know, first of all, you have to say, oh, well, but Playboy's so visual, it's got all the beautiful women, it's got this sort of sexy lifestyle, it'd be a natural. But, you know, there were a lot of franchises that were naturals. I mean, you know, MTV is a huge hit. Why wasn't it Rolling Stone? You know, CNN is a huge hit. Why wasn't it Time or Newsweek? My husband lives for ESPN. Could have been Sports Illustrated. And I think that the big mistake that a lot of companies made when they were trying to think about that transition is they thought that they already had the creative people and the content, and it was sort of just about putting it in this other medium. Whereas what we thought was we had to find the intersection between the brand and how people used that other medium. So when we went into TV, we decided, back to the question you asked, Sukhinder, about, you know, being a men's magazine, that if we just did a channel for, you know, a bunch of lonely guys on Saturday night, it wouldn't be a very big business. So why didn't we think more ambitiously about taking what was the sophistication and quality of Playboy and creating a sexy channel that couples would watch, which would be a much bigger business. So we did something quite different than what the magazine is. And on the other hand, we recognized that even in a world of 50 channels, you probably weren't going to be able to do on Playboy TV, you know, a long 5-part series investigating where the money to fund terrorism in Iraq comes from, which we could do in Playboy magazine. So we kind of made it, you know, kind of fun, sexy entertainment all the time for couples. Because that worked, that got me interested in what other platforms are out there. And in the early 90s, there there was a lot of buzz around what was called new media. So we struck partnerships with companies and did things like a CD-ROM with IBM that was the Playboy interview, searchable by subject with video and audio and text and photographs, and a technology that I don't think lasted very long, but called CDI with Philips, in which we took all of this great video content that we had created around sensual massage for couples and put it in a different format for CDI. We did a virtual art tour because we have an extraordinary collection. So we started to play with the idea of multimedia on other people's nickels, because we're not a big company. And we started to think about what we could do in this new thing called, the internet. And one of the hallmarks of my philosophy of business is that you can never be out and about too much. That it's great to be around smart people in terms of the people you work with, but it's equally great to be out in the world beyond the people you work with, and whether that means what you read, or whether you go to a conference, or whether you are working on a political campaign or whatever. So I went and always went to different conferences, and I met Jim Clark, who may be a name some of you know. Jim Clark was the creator of Mosaic, which was the precursor to Netscape. And Jim and I were at a conference together, and we started talking, and I said, I was so intrigued by what was happening in the internet, but what other publishing companies were doing was they were striking deals with people like Prodigy and CompuServe, where they were taking a license fee and giving to those companies the right to do whatever kind of they wanted to, both commercially and creatively. And it just seemed to me that that's okay if you don't think that's a core business opportunity, but if you think there's a real business there, then wouldn't you want to control it? And I just felt, given the demographic of the early adapters, which was a great Playboy demo, given the success in TV, that bringing the world of Playboy online was something we ought to try and do. And Jim said to me, this is in like 1992, maybe early 93, well, I can build this infrastructure so people can just type playboy.com and they'll go to your site. Now, I know when I say this to you, this sounds like about as revolutionary as if I said, I have this device and I can talk to my husband in Chicago. It's like mind-blowing. Right. But trust me, no one thought that way then. Certainly not, I'm sure, people who were steeped in the technology or from the scientific community did, but trust me, nobody in the mainstream media community thought about that. So then, of course, my next thought was, oh, sure you can, and it will cost me $1 gazillion. And he said, no, it won't. And so he built it for us. And the question we had was, if we build it, will they come? Will anyone want to go to a site called playboy.com? And we found they did, and then the adventure began.
So as you sort of already identified with your pay TV strategy, part of crafting that strategy was deciding how to take this brand asset, this media asset, and port it or redefine it. So if you think about your digital foray, I would just ask, what were the key tenets that were redefined? And I'm also curious, as you look back on, you've been in digital longer than almost, every other media player, a traditional media player. What do you think worked well, and what do you think didn't work well in your first attempts at digital?
Well, we started with the idea that, because we had no idea really what it might mean, that we would be creatively risk-taking, but fiscally conservative. I'm sure everybody's heard the kind of classic old expression in business that you don't make a decision where you bet the ranch. Okay. So in our company, we consider that we don't bet the mansion. We don't want to I don't want to do something where I have to call my father up and go, I found a lovely 2-bedroom in Westwood for you. The van is on the way. And so, to be honest, if we had made as big mistakes as Disney made with Go or Time Warner made with Pathfinder, not only would I not be sitting here, there would be no Playboy Enterprises. So we had to kind of bootstrap it at the beginning, and from the beginning, I was intrigued by the idea of not trying to pigeonhole what it would be. So we thought, because we were in pay television, we could try selling content. We thought, obviously, because we had advertising in the magazine, we could try selling advertising. Because we had catalog businesses, we thought we could try selling product. And we tried to sort of try a lot of different things, really on the cheap, and see kind of what worked. One decision we made early on that I thought was very important in hindsight was to not treat the online advertising as a kind of premium with purchase. You know, you buy pages of the magazine and you kind of get some online advertising. Kind of back to my feeling that if you thought it was a real business and was really valuable, then you had to treat it with respect. So we felt that we had to value the advertising online from the beginning and treat it that way. So in the early days, we used a rep firm that was able to sell other online offerings, and then we took it in-house later, and now we have an integrated ad sales team between the magazine and online, because now virtually all of the advertisers that we talk to want both a print and online, you know, solution. But that, I think, was important early on. I think that digital is exponentially more fun, but also harder than print or television, because I don't think you ever get to say, oh, well, we've got that licked, and then just execute. It's like constant innovation. And actually one of the mistakes I think we made, and I've said this publicly so I can say it again, is that because we moved early, we had older architecture. And I went through several years of frustration with our people saying, I don't understand why there can't be more user-generated content on the site. I don't understand why there isn't more community. I don't understand why the site's so difficult to navigate. I don't understand, you know, all these things, and they would, you know, kind of basically say, well, we're working on it, you know. And then I would get new people, and they would say they were working on it. And then after a couple years of that, we got a new team of people, and to their credit, they kind of came to me and said, here's the real story. We can't give you what you want, or more importantly, what the consumer wants, unless we rebuild the site. So you have to give us permission to sort of not make this business have to grow for a year or 18 months, and let us reinvest in it, and then we'll come out of that and we'll have the ability that will be able to start to realize the potential of how people use the web, which has obviously changed dramatically from the mid-90s. And that's actually what we did over the last year. And I think the bigger challenge will be now, since I've stepped down as CEO, for the team to make sure that what they've done is not just like, you know, refurbish the house, but created a culture and a platform that can constantly be experimenting and testing and getting feedback and changing.
In that vein, if I understand it, Playboy.com's got e-commerce, it's got subscriptions, it's got advertising, it's got gaming, and you've also now added some social networking components. So as you look at that kind of portfolio and the online presence, what are the things that have been successful for you, or what do you think will be the interesting components going forward?
Well, happily, all of those have been successful for us, so that's good. There wasn't anything we tried where we said, well, that just, you know, that just doesn't work. iGaming is not so big for us as I think it should be. In Europe, gambling online is not just legal, it's totally legitimate, and we have a partner, and we do poker online and casino gaming online. But I just think that the bigger, you know, if you define it more broadly, gaming, so it can include gambling where that's legal and not for pay where it isn't. I just think that's such a natural space for us to play in, and I would hope that that gets realized. I'm also very intrigued, and partly because of mobile, with the idea of being able to sort of deliver really usable information and advice quickly. So one of the things we're launching are a series of city guides. So in the magazine, it'll be the traditional voice of expertise that a great magazine has. So the editors are going to tell you the best sports bar and the coolest dance bar and the best steakhouse and all that. But online, it's going to be all user-generated, and the idea is to sort of build communities around that and then deliver it so you land at the Miami airport or the Tampa airport for the Super Bowl, and you can kind of access Playboy's take on what would be cool to do. So that notion of creating that mix between not losing the voice of authority that a great brand has, but giving your, you know, community permission to engage themselves and in it, I think is going to be very important for us going forward.
Well, it's interesting. Two things you've touched on, both the community aspect as well as gaming, actually speak to, I think, part of Playboy's larger strategy, which you've identified before, which is people think of Playboy have historically thought Playboy as a magazine, but really it's a lifestyle brand. And in the context of a lifestyle brand, some of those digital choices are reinforcing that wider brand, which is the gaming and sort of around entertainment, and it sounds like the community, but the community for city guides and lifestyle is really an evolution of the brand to have even wider meaning.
I agree with that, and I think that it also reflects a view I have, which is that the best strategy, at least for us, is a kind of high-tech, high-touch. Because I really believe in the connectivity of live, and that's really powerful for certain kinds of brands. I mean, it's why Disney has theme parks. Now, obviously, that's a profit center, but it's more than a profit center. It's people experiencing the brand. So when we opened a year and a half ago, a casino, club, private party space, comedy club store, all under the Playboy brand with the Palms in Las Vegas, that was all about creating a multifaceted live entertainment space that then should have a digital component to it. There should be a kind of behind the velvet rope party element online, and a kind of virtual membership element online, and an entertainment element online. And I think that that's, for consumers, important going forward. One of the things that's really been interesting about Playboy over all these years is that it just has a connection with its consumers that's much deeper than almost any other magazine. I mean, it really has fans, you know, it has collectors of the magazine, and that's very leverageable, but it also means you have to nurture that, because I think when you have a brand, everything you do either is a deposit or a withdrawal from your brand bank. And if you're running a company, you have to be withdrawing because that's how you're leveraging new businesses, but you better also be depositing, or you'll wake up one morning and discover that the trademark equity you thought you had has actually been squandered. And so we think all the time about what we shouldn't do. And I actually think the most interesting business book that has never been written that I know of is a book that would interview business leaders about the things they decided not to do. Because I think you can learn as much about strategy and leadership from that. And of course, that's never usually visible, you know, sort of by definition. But I think it's actually an interesting insight into thinking of how organizations work.
And so as you have made decisions about Playboy over the last 20 years, and this is a slight digression from digital, but I think in keeping with the larger theme, do you evaluate every decision in the form of this is a brand company, and this is this a deposit or is this a withdrawal? And I'm going to think about every decision we make within that context? Yeah,
we pretty much do. I mean, you also, because we're a public company, you know, it's sort of a, quadrants. The brand is one axis, but the other is the financial impact. I mean, you're obviously looking for big ideas or things that can move the needle. And I think it's okay to do things that are sort of, neutral to modestly positive for the brand if they're, really big financial benefits or really help you build your audience. But I think you have to be really careful about doing things that are going to hurt your brand. And now, in decades past, companies could sort of manage their brand in isolation around the world. Like they could go do things in China and things they would never do, say, in Europe, and they would figure that it wouldn't matter, and so they could sort of, squeeze, the turnip in one part of the world. But now it's such a connected world that you better have, consistent protection and respect for your brand, because you can't do that anymore.
As an aside, I don't know if many of you are aware, I think you guys are planning a second lifestyle and entertainment center.
Yeah, we're building in Macau
in
right
China,
now.
right?
Yeah,
and
we're building in Macau.
And your partner there is it the Wynn?
Well, it's a consortium of Melco is the gaming partner, W and the Ritz are our hotel partners, Esun is the entertainment partner. So they're different partners for different pieces of it.
So you're moving that piece of the business actually to China, in addition to.
But we've been in China for more than 20 years
on the consumer product side.
I was an early believer in that, actually.
Yeah, China, a whole other story.
Yeah. Well, you guys have some experience in China?
Yes, just a little bit.
Oh, you have to tell me about it someday.
Exactly. Maybe we'll talk about that another time. So before I go any further, if we have any questions, please go to the mic or the podium. Otherwise, I won't know to stop, because we definitely have lots to talk about. and as you line up, then I'll break from questions. So just coming back to digital for a moment, though, in that construct. So we chatted a little bit about what you all have tried that's worked. If you look at other magazines, what do you think they've done that's been successful or not? I mean, who are traditional media players that you look at and say, here's some who successfully made the leap and some who didn't?
Well, I'm a big admirer of ESPN. Now, of course, it didn't start as a magazine. It started as a television network. But I think, and I know some of the people there, so that infuses my perspective. But I think they genuinely think in a multi-platform way. I think they really try and think that way. So it isn't like, the favored child and the stepchildren. And I think they also are very good at actually understanding and communicating what their brand stands for, because I think sometimes there's confusion between what's just a well-known product name and what I would consider a brand. And a brand to me has to have a kind of an attitude about it that is more than just the product it defines, and as such it can be moved from product to product. So I would say Virgin is a brand, American Airlines is the name of an airline. Nike is a brand, Adidas is a shoe. So I think ESPN has been good in both. There's no question, you mentioned that I've been active for many years with the Magazine Publishers Association, that both small magazines and big magazine companies now understand that their future is really dependent on their redefining their business so that their brands and their content live beyond the pages of the magazine. And so you're seeing that being done in 100 different ways, obviously online, but also with a real embracing of mobile and experimentation of mobile. I mean, you all know very well that the development of mobile as a delivery mechanism for entertainment is really pretty piss poor in this country compared to other parts of the world. But that's going to change, and I always encourage my colleagues in the magazine business, some of whom do international magazines, to go play in Europe or go play in Asia or go play somewhere else where the technology is better and figure out, what does it mean to have the assets of Backpacker in a mobile, format. And I think that there's going to be a certain amount of, economic Darwinism going on here. So there are probably going to be fewer magazines in 10 years than today, and the ones that survive will be both great magazines, I believe, but also magazines that think more broadly.
And potentially great brands.
Yes.
Which is one of your overarching themes, that you have the potential to be, not all great companies are great brands. And the great brands gives you a wider platform in some ways in which to play. One other thought on digital, as we touch on that, and then I've got a few other questions that I'd love to ask you. On the digital side, it sounds that you've got a relaunch coming. The relaunch is not yet live, right? It's in the process?
I think they're in beta.
They're in beta, got it. And I think part of that relaunch is rebuilding the architecture and so on. What else do you hope comes from the relaunch? And how are you defining the aspirations for that relaunch and Playboy.com going forward?
Well, one of the things that we did was we've actually merged the editorial teams between the magazine and the online business, which is a pretty radical thing for a company that has, as its sort of linchpin a magazine. But I felt it was really critical because we really need to think about all the time how we should be covering what we think the world of Playboy is in the different media. And to just have occasional contributions or occasional collaboration just isn't really going to get there. One of the things that I think will be really important for everybody, and here we have the benefit of our experience and expertise in television, is obviously what used to be sort of the graphics and text world that we launched in is really a video-driven world now, and how to re-envision what that means is something that we're working on, and I am hopeful that will be embraced. Another thing I think that's true for us and for others is, there was a period where the school of thought was your kind of ultimate objective was to build a site that was so compelling that it had so many millions of uniques and it was so sticky and they spent so much time there that it's like they never wanted to leave. And that was kind of, that was sort of the thing you aspired to. And we don't aspire to that, and I don't think anybody that I know that's thinking about this stuff aspires to that anymore. You want to get your content out lots of other places. You want to go connect with people that you think should have affinity for what you're doing when they're other places. And so that's a kind of transformative
notion of an open content distribution system as opposed to kind of this notion of hoarding or closed system on the web. And as you think about .com versus the TV assets versus the media assets, are the audiences different? Has .com expanded your audience base? How do women fit into that audience base now? I'm curious. How's the audience base evolved for .com, and then even the broader audience bases for the magazine and for the TV assets?
Well, in the early years of .com, it was a sensational way to really strengthen the connection with 18 to 24-year-old young men, because they were the early adapters. They're a critical part of the Playboy franchise. And that served us well just in that marketing sense, separate from Playboy.com as a business. Now that online usage is sort of ubiquitous, it doesn't have as differentiated a demographic profile. On the other hand, it's critical for us because there's no question that more consumers are getting their entertainment and information online and on mobile versus in print, and more advertising dollars are moving into online and mobile versus in print. So what we're trying to say is, our mantra is to grow our total audience and grow our total ad sales and grow our total profits. And we want to be relatively agnostic, and we certainly don't want to try and resist where the consumer or the advertiser is going to go anywhere, anyway. The women piece of it is, I think, an unrealized opportunity. And I'm hoping that as there are more community elements added to the site, and there will be a great deal more lifestyle content on the new site, that will provide opportunities for how to do that. And part of that may also be partnering with different other sites or other companies that have audiences that ought to be interested in being part of the world of Playboy, but maybe already have a deeper relationship with another brand or another site.
Got it. And just to touch on, you talked about couples, not just men, being the audience for the TV assets, and the audience for the magazine. What is the female composition?
That's remained, predominantly male, although one of the things that made me think we could do the couples TV is that there were always several million women readers of the magazine. Now that's a small percentage of a magazine that has 10 million readers, but it's not a small number.
Right. So there was a certain appeal of the magazine to the women, and obviously you were able to capture appeal in the TV space, and the hope is that digital will also expand total audience.
Yes.
With a level of being agnostic between these different channels in a way which I suggest would be nirvana for most total media companies. Because historically it's not been the case. There has been this competition between these different channels for audience and for ad dollars, and so that's an interesting transformation. We're actually only have about 10 minutes left, but a couple other areas I'd love to touch on. So we've talked about the evolution of digital, and Playboy continues to be actually, I think, one of the preeminent American brands when you think about it. I think, Christy, your point about Playboy, actually, the brand being much bigger than the company is a very interesting one, and I think it would be a surprise for all of us to know just how big the brand is relative, to a mid-sized growth company. But it really speaks to the aspiration of the company in being able to create that kind of image for itself, an iconic view from consumers. I want to come back to sort of your fit and philosophies with Playboy as it has developed over time. There are certainly people who would say it was unconventional for you to have joined, as you've gone on to be an advocate of women, of free expression. Certainly free expression makes sense. How do you think about your view and advocacy of feminism, and how that plays with Playboy as a brand, and how do you think those two things intersect?
Well, I think I'm partly a creature of my, childhood, as we all are. Doesn't mean that you can't move beyond it, but it's a factor. And in my case, I was raised by my mom, and my mom always had the magazine on our coffee table, along with the New Yorker and Atlantic and Time and everything else she read. She was a great reader, is a great reader, and among the many things that she gave me as gifts was a love of reading. And I grew up in the era where the politics of the magazine, whether it was in favor of safe and legal abortion and contraceptive rights, or against the Vietnam War, or for sane drug policy, or for civil rights or the environment, were my generation's politics. So the first thing that was true in my life is that I'm one of the only kids of my friends who didn't have this huge generation gap issue with their parents, because my mother and my father's values and views were really more consistent with my generation than their generation. I also came of age at a time when the early feminist movement was really embracing sex and sexuality. The pill was just available for the first time. Things like Our Bodies, Ourselves, and Joy of Sex, and sort of exploring and erotic art done by feminists was all very powerful. So my formative years were in kind of an ethos and a kind of environment in which, for me, feminism was a movement of liberation, as was sexual liberation, as was civil rights, as were gay rights. And in fact, if you looked at other cultures, those cultures that oppressed women were also those cultures that were oppressive about sex and sexuality. Then when I was in college and out of college, obviously there was a part of the women's movement that decided that they no longer felt that sexual freedom was a good thing for women, that in fact, as some of the rhetoric at the time went, that all men are rapists, that all heterosexual sex is rape, that women who are being viewed in any way as sexual or sexy are being objectified and demeaned. And that was a hard time for Playboy, because the people at Playboy, starting with my father, sort of thought, well, wait a minute, we're on your side, that's not what it's all about. Now I think, we've sort of come out the other side, and younger women who have come of age after the sexual revolution and after the women's movement's formative stages, at least as I've seen them and in the research that I've seen, have kind of internalized both and feel very comfortable with, dressing up and looking sexy to go to a club to dance, very comfortable watching a sexy movie with their boyfriend, but also absolutely assume that they're going to be paid the same, have all the career opportunities. When they get married, their husband's going to be around taking care of the kids. And so Playboy has sort of come full circle in a way in which now it has more women in its audience than it ever did before. We actually produce the highest rated entertainment show on the E! channel, which is called The Girls Next Door, which is a reality show based on life and the 3 young women that live at the Playboy Mansion with my dad. And when it runs on cable, it outperforms every other show on cable for women 18 to 29. We do $1 billion a year at retail of consumer products, of apparel and jewelry, accessories around the world. 75% of those are women's products. So it's been, an interesting sort of journey in that sense.
Right, and it seems sort of what you're resonating with is the intersection between Playboy and your values has been around liberation and choice in all of these areas. And
social justice, respect for the individual, personal freedom, humanism, those are the values I believe in. And interestingly, I think if you create a culture like that, you wind up with a diverse workforce without ever having to work at it, because
right, and it attracts them to that. So let's end on that note, because I think that there has been obviously a great deal about you as an icon for female leadership, but then you yourself have invested a fair amount of your career and time in promoting I think other female leaders, executives, providing mentorship, and then obviously founding and participating in some incredible organizations, as we talked about earlier. But what do you think the barriers still are? So you sit in this, I think, place of incredible perspective as someone who is the first to do it. You interact with women of your generation and leaders of your generation. I know certainly you're interacting with women like me and of our generation, so you've seen this incredible transformation. But what's still left? And I guess what frustrates you? What do you think the barriers still are for women?
Well, I thought 20 years ago, because there were not very many female CEOs of public companies, that one of the big barriers would be generational. And I think that I was right about that, and that barrier is falling, and that's a really good thing. And what I meant by that was that, basically companies were run by men, and they were of an era that their wives hadn't worked outside the home in the main, that they hadn't gone to business school or law school with very many other women. And so the world that they sort of grew up with was a world in which they hadn't been exposed to millions of ambitious, talented women. And so you would hear a guy who was not like a bad guy say something as stupid as, well, we tried a woman in that job and it didn't work. Like, well, we tried someone with 2 legs in that job, but that didn't work. So that barrier, I think, is falling, and certainly out here where I think age is no barrier to getting ahead, that's really true. I think we still have the challenge of the work-life balance issue. I mean, it's still true that once people want to start a family, that there's a disproportionate burden that falls on women that doesn't fall on men to do that balancing. And that has all kinds of implications in terms of, whether you want to move, what hours you can work, whether you take some time off. And I would have thought we would have gotten better at cracking that. I mean, we put in flex time and part-time benefits and all that stuff, 20 years ago, and I think pretty much everybody does that. But I don't think we've done a really good job of finding the right role for government, whether that's supporting daycare, finding the right role for the business. So I think that's still a big issue for women. But then there's also a kind of a redefinition of success. There are more people employed by women-owned companies in this country than people employed by the Fortune 500, right? More people employed by women-owned companies than people employed by the Fortune 500. And the reason for that is that a lot of women are pursuing an entrepreneurial career. They just like that idea, and they don't get measured as easily as the statistics that look at the percent of women on the boards of Fortune 500 companies and all of that gets measured. But if you look at where the jobs are being created, it's not being created by the largest industrial companies, it's being created by the smaller, high growth companies. So part of it may be also how we decide we want to measure what success is, which I think is entirely personal. I mean, sometimes young women will say, well, I'm trying to decide whether, where I should go to work. And I always say, I can't tell you that. You have to find the right culture that's the right fit for you. And some people are happy being trailblazers, and we're all the beneficiaries of that because otherwise the world would never change. But some people don't want to be the only person that looks like them sitting around the table when decisions are made. And if you're that kind of person, whether you're openly gay or your English is not your first language or you're female or whatever, then you should know that about yourself, and you should match what you know about yourself with where you want to do your work. And if where you're doing your work gives you the chances that you seek to be successful, then I think it's a little bit of a misnomer to measure it just based on the stats of who's at the boardroom around Fortune 500 companies.
That may be not the only statistic in which to measure success. And
not that shouldn't be, we shouldn't keep making progress there. Over 40% of Playboy's executives are women. And once you break the tipping point, then every talented woman that's out there wants to work for you because they look around. Once you break that tipping point, that then they have a partner, and it's okay they have a partner, but they can't bring the partner and dance with the partner at the holiday party. Once you change that, you get to fish in a really big pool of talented people. And I don't have to say that at a culture like this, but there are a lot of cultures where that's still not quite there yet.
One small anecdote, which I didn't hear from Christy, but I heard from one of her team, which I'd love for you to just share because I found it a little amusing, was, you even had to face a little bit of this at Playboy. I recall there was an incident where you bumped into a lawyer in the halls of Playboy, which I thought was amusing, maybe not so amusing in hindsight, but if you would care to share with the team, I think it's a great
He didn't
little
work
story.
for Playboy. He was a hotshot lawyer, and I was not president at the time. I was a vice president. He was a hotshot lawyer who was in Chicago on some business, and I was walking from one office to another, and this man who I didn't know passed me in the hall, and I mean, he didn't know who I was, what my job was, but he stopped me, like sort of cut me off, thrust this sheath of, this would be in like 1979, maybe 1980, thrust this sheath of papers in to me and said, "Could you make copies of these, please?"
I know, it's incredible to imagine now, right? I mean, we can't even fathom it, but when I heard the story.
You know, my first thought was like my jaw dropped, you know, but I was very well raised. I actually put a high premium on manners. And I said, "I'll certainly see if I can find someone who could do that for you." And, you know, he went back into the conference room. So I found an assistant and I said, "If you could make a copy of this, they need it in the conference room." So then about an hour later, our general counsel came into my office and said, "There's somebody I'd like you to meet. Could you come in the conference room?" And I said, "Sure." You see where the story is going, right? So I stand in the doorway and Frank says to this hotshot attorney, "I'd like you to meet Christie Hefner." And I think this man saw like his billable hours fall to the floor.
Well, I mean, I think it is a testament to you and all your work, and obviously the work of a tremendous number of women leaders that have come before us, that those days today would be incredibly hard to imagine, but also just speaks to the transformation that the country's overgone over the last 30 years, and of which you have been an integral part, and I think a role model for many, many people. So with that, we're going to wrap up, but with one final question, I think that maybe on some of your minds. I know Christy gets asked it a lot by the press. She's just recently made the decision that she's going to move on from Playboy, which has been obviously a defining part of her career, though not the only defining part of her career for the last 30 years. And so the obvious question is, what are you thinking about next?
Well, I've been thinking for a while about wanting to have another chapter in my professional life. You know, as I was sharing with you, I came into the company not because it was what I thought I was going to do professionally, but because originally my father invited me and then the company got in trouble. So I think that what propelled me to finally say, you know, you really, if you're serious, to myself, if you're serious about this, then you need to move, was Barack's election. I've worked for Barack since he first decided to run for the U.S. Senate seat back when nobody believed he could win that primary. I sat in his box when he gave this speech at the Democratic Convention that sort of propelled him, and I just think that he is a first-class person in every respect. So November was the 20th anniversary of my becoming CEO and Barack's election, and I thought, well, if I needed an excuse, this is it, kiddo. So I'm hoping that a meaningful chunk of my time will be in working probably with a think tank on policy and communication strategy for the administration. I live in Chicago, and my husband and I actually love Chicago, and so I don't want a job that requires me to live in Washington, but I'm more than willing to spend time there. So I'm working on putting that together. And then I'd like to take some of the experiences and perspective that I have about business, especially at a time when, you know, the sort of prominent business people that are featured out there are the crooks, and talk about principled leadership and the fact that, as Barack himself stands for, that you can have social values but also get things done. And so I think I will do some of that on television, and some of that through speaking, and maybe some of that through writing. So I'm not looking for a big job. If I wanted a big job, I would stay with the one I had. I'm looking to sort of put an interesting mix of things together that lets me give back and still be challenged.
That's great. Well, if the last 20 years is any testament, I think we're all curious and excited to see what the next 20 years of Christie Hefner's life looks like. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.